5 years ago this week, a group of injured ex-GM workers from Colombia set up an encampment in front of the U.S. Embassy in Bogota to demand justice for a practice GM has been doing for decades, which is firing workers after being disabled by the very work GM has them doing, and without any form of compensation. Paige, Shell-Spurling, and Soto are two activists who felt compelled enough to do what they can in the United States to raise awareness while the workers continue to protest outside the embassy in Colombia. They're on a summer-long bike ride, bringing the message of these Colombian workers to GM here in the United States. The Real News caught up with them as they rode through Baltimore this week.
So we did research, we figured out where the board members for General Motors live, and now we're bringing it to their doorstep, literally. My name is Paige Shell-Spurling, and I'm an organizer with the Portland Central America Solidarity Committee. We're going on a bike trip to support the injured Colombian General Motors workers.
My name's Soto, and I as well am supporting PCAS and the injured Colombian workers in Bogota, Colombia.
Workers at the plant use antiquated equipment. Health and safety measures are virtually absent. Workdays can last up to 14 hours, and employees are required to work a minimum of 6 days a week. After 3 or 4 years, many workers develop serious muscle and nervous disorders that essentially disable them and often plunge them and their families into poverty. Paige and Joe are 5 weeks into their ride, whose purpose is to bring the workers' message not only to the footsteps of GM management and their shareholders, but to the American public, hoping at the same time to explain how the mistreatment of these workers in Colombia is something that may come back to the United States if it's ignored.
A lot of what is being faced by Colombian workers right now with the occupational safety issues, with the death threats, with just the reality that they face is similar to what workers in the U.S. were facing in the early 1900s. But we see this in a global context. So we do see companies outsourcing and that sort of thing. With General Motors, what's going on is that they have this production plant in South America, in Colombia, and they're selling their vehicles that are made there down there. They're not bringing those vehicles back up to the United States, but what they are trying to bring back up are the working conditions. So they're turning to the U.S. workers and they're saying, listen, you guys have to accept these concessions. You have to, give us these takebacks, because if not, you're not competitive.
But Paige says the blame can't all be piled onto GM. The American government must accept part of the blame as well, she says, seeing as it crafted the Colombia Free Trade Agreement GM is benefiting from. And also seeing as the U.S. bailed GM out after the 2008 financial crisis.
These workers, they set up their tent encampment, and one of their banners says, U.S. labor violations under the nose of the U.S. Embassy. Because if you remember, General Motors was bailed out, so it came underneath the major shareholder was the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government, if they had wanted to resolve this, they could have done it, and they chose not to. So even though, intellectual property rights and things like that, the other side of the free trade agreements, there's plenty of capacity for those things to happen, and that has political will. When it's, workers and their rights and communities and the environment, that side of the equation is not protected. GM, was negligent, and they caused these injuries, and they've just found that it's easier to develop a sophisticated system of getting these guys out than it is to do the right thing and prevent the injuries in the first place.
But while GM and the American government have refused to acknowledge the grievances of injured Colombian workers, Paige says their encampment and sustained actions against their mistreatment has slightly improved conditions at the plant in Bogota by way of deterrence.
Yeah, just to give a little update, the presence of these workers in front of the embassy for the 5 years that they've been there has made a huge difference in Colombia. They've been able to hold off laws that would have legalized the firing of injured workers, laws that GM tried to push along with other multinational corporations. They've made the space inside of the plant for workers to organize. There's currently a union of injured workers that has formed. There have been thousands of workers that have been injured at this plant, and it's been going on for decades. But this is the first group of workers that has stood up to General Motors and stood up to this practice. They've received death threats for standing up to the company. And so at this point, after 5 years into it, it's just a handful of workers that are still holding on, that are still there in front of the embassy.
Paige, who was 31 when she visited Colombia and discovered the group of injured and rebellious GM workers, says that sadly the board members they've visited so far seem not to acknowledge the problem at all.
We went to Linda Gooden's house, and she lives in a high-rise condo. So we were able to call from downstairs, and we called up to her, and she answered, and as soon as she heard what we were calling about, she hung up. So we came back the next day and we left her a message, and we came back the next day and we went inside and we knocked on the door and we talked to her husband. She lives in Annapolis, so she's really close to Baltimore. And it's really interesting because she grew up actually with a dad who's a steel worker, and her brother got injured on the job. He was a tool and die worker. He got injured on the job, fought with the company for a number of years, very similar to what she's inflicting upon these workers in Colombia. So we're asking her to, really take a look at what she's doing and be one of the voices on the board of directors calling for a settlement for this handful of workers. It'd be very easy for General Motors to do so. They're reporting record profits, so this would be a good year for them to do it.
When asked why after 5 years they've decided to embark on a bike trip that many, especially at GM, could easily dismiss, Paige said it was the least they could do as the injured workers in Colombia continue to struggle not only at the GM plants, but through their forms of protest, which reflect the kind of desperation they feel.
The guys in Colombia, they've struggled really hard. They've gone through multiple hunger strikes, stitching their lips closed. They've literally with a needle and thread, yes. They've done symbolic crucifixions where they've tied themselves to wooden crosses. They've done a burial action where they took 24-hour shifts burying themselves in the ground up to their necks. I mean, just incredible stuff to try to just bring this out of the shadows, bring it to national attention, international attention. And it really needs to be supported by, actions here in the United States.